by just mentioning the speed of light issue, because this is brought up a lot. And I was talking to a gentleman who disagreed with me on the age of the Earth a couple weeks ago, and he just said, "Oh, I mean, I have no idea why this argument is used so often, because it's really not as powerful as people think that it is." There's a couple of reasons why I would say that. First of all, in order to reconstruct the history of the universe, you have to have a pretty good understanding of what's going on with just your basic physics, right? And there's plenty of reason to say that there's lots of fundamental stuff that we just have no idea what's going on in terms of basic physics. The kind of classic example is the conflict between our current theory of gravity and our theory of the quantum world, or the world on the level of the very small. So these two theories are incompatible with each other. They falsify each other in a strict sense. So for example, in the standard theory of particle physics, what's going on at the smallest level, particles can get what they call entangled with each other, which means they get related to each other such that even if they're on opposite ends of the universe, when one changes, the other is going to change immediately. However, it is just an axiom. It's at the very core of our current theory of gravity that the absolute limitation on how one thing can affect another in space is the speed of light. So the former thing should be impossible if the latter is true. Now, obviously, there's some theory that we just have not discovered, which is going to unite these two together, or it's going to undermine one and put something new in its place. But we are not at the position where we have a sufficient understanding of what's going on in the physical world to, I think, reconstruct the history of the cosmos. So here's another example. When you take the basic theory of gravitation and you use it to predict where celestial matter should be, where stars should be, it works very well with the solar system. When you start to get beyond that, when you start to get to things like supergalactic clusters, it is wrong. It predicts things which are radically wrong by many, many, many orders of magnitude. And this is where the theory of dark matter or dark energy comes from. So what dark matter basically is it's matter which is completely invisible, which has how much matter would need to exist in order to explain why there's this much gravity that's acting on the stars and shaping them in the way that they're shaped. So it's essentially just an ad hoc argument. We only observe a certain amount of matter, but the amount of gravity that would be needed to explain why stars are arranged the way that they are is much, much, much higher. So evidence for it, other than the fact that our current theory makes radically false predictions at that level. So I think there's just a great deal that we don't understand about what's going on at the physical on the physical world. Even apart from that, however, when you ask the question, how does an argument give evidence for one idea or another idea? Both ideas cannot share the same problem, right? So if the speed of light is going to provide evidence that the standard model of cosmology is basically correct, and the young age view is incorrect, then the standard model should lack the problem that the young age has. But it doesn't. We observe stars that are 20 billion light years away. That's 7 billion years older than the age of the universe, even according to the standard model. When you recognize that the light that we see that's allegedly 20 billion light years away or older than the age of the universe is supposed to come from the very earliest part of the universe, we're looking back through time, we should be observing a universe which is quite different than the one that we're looking at today. However, that's not what we observe at all. In fact, it looks basically structured like the universe we observe on a very close level near our galaxy and within the Milky Way galaxy. So in fact, both the old age and the young age interpretations of the universe have the same problem. Both of them observe that there's light that's way too old for the universe, meaning we both have to say there's something we don't understand about light. There's something fundamental that we're missing that we're going to discover in the future. We have, I think, a tendency to just implicitly place our own understanding of the world at the end point of the scientific endeavor. But imagine the world continues to exist for another 2,000 years. Now, 2,000 years from now, it will seem absolutely ludicrous that 150 years people were acting like we basically worked everything out and we only have little details to work out. Because whenever we look at things they missed, they didn't even know they were missing. It's not that they have knowledge and then they later filled it in. They know that they were missing this information. So I say that both of our models have the same And so the speed of light can't be used to argue for one or the other. Now, with respect to things like radiometric dating, which is what I think what was being asked about. Let me scroll down here. I want to the atomic ages of rocks. What this is referring to is in rocks, you have a process called radiometric decay. What that means is that there's one at how much of both elements there are in relation to each other. Given the fact that it decays at a pretty constant rate, you're able to date the age of that rock. Interesting research project that was done several years ago. It's called the RATE project, Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth. And one of the most interesting things about this is the predictions that they made on the basis of a young Earth understanding of the world. So if radiometric decay is compatible with something like a 6,000-year-old Earth, then at some point in the past, radiometric decay had to have been massively sped up. Now, if it was massively sped up, there are things that we should observe in the rocks. So radiometric decay very often produces helium. Helium is a byproduct of that process where one element turns into another. But helium is what they call a leaky element. It's going to leak out from rocks very quickly, and it leaks at a constant rate. So if all of this radiometric decay happened in the relatively recent past, you can predict very precisely how much helium there should be in these rocks. You can predict it quantitatively. That is, out of trillions of possible values, you can give an exact number and say, that is how much there should be in here if the world is this old. Now, the gentleman involved in this research project did a very bold thing, and it paid off. They published these predictions in publicly. They're on the internet. You can go to the Wayback Machine. You can look at these predictions. And then they sent their rocks out to secular laboratories, multiple secular laboratories, so that they were tested independently, and they waited to see whether their predictions were going to be confirmed or falsified. When the data came back, their predictions were confirmed to a very, very precise and exact degree. This is something which many people say that young age creationists don't make predictions, but in fact, there have been many such predictions which have ended up being confirmed. And I think this is one of the most impressive. I've gone through and I've looked at critical reviews of this project. And the only thing that critics of these gentlemen agree upon is that they made a mistake, but nobody can really agree what mistake they made. I mean, people are making mutually exclusive arguments for how they got this data, even though it's wrong. Related to the point I made earlier about being respectful and cordial to those who disagree with us, the gentlemen involved in this project, their research was very good, it was very robust, and it was well produced and written. They presented this at a mainstream scientific conference openly as young Earth creationists, and they were given a very warm and cordial reception, and they had a good discussion with the gentleman who believed in the standard model of Earth history. So there's still problems. Radiometric decay produces heat. So if that much radiometric decay happened all at once, it would produce so much heat that if there was not another process which was balancing it out, it would melt the Earth. So that is a problem, and it's a present area of research. But there's a difference between, I would argue, a problem which exists in relation to the data and a problem which exists in one's internal model. So a problem which exists in relation to the data is when one makes a prediction that is falsified, or there's something one should expect to find in the world and it's not there. And a problem in one's internal model is something like the so-called contradiction between gravity and quantum mechanics. That is, you have an internal discordance, but that indicates that we need to do more research. We need to study it more. We need to figure out a broader concept of how the physical world works. But I think the data itself is very strong in saying a great deal of radiometric decay happened in a very short period of time. Another thing is what they call intrinsic radiocarbon. So people will sometimes call all radiometric dating carbon dating, but actually carbon dating is only used for rocks which are supposed to be very young because it decays very, very, very fast. And that means that when you get to rocks which are supposed to be millions of years old, you're not going to find any carbon whatsoever, except you do. You find carbon in every rock sample you put in. And this is a very substantial problem for the mainstream understanding of how these rocks are formed, because they shouldn't have any carbon. So what that means is if the world is this old, if these rocks really are that old, that carbon has to be a contamination. It has to come from a source other than the rock itself. And that contamination has been very thoroughly studied. They've ruled out essentially any possible source of contamination but the carbon is still there. So if you want to calculate the amount of carbon which is in a particular rock, what they actually do is they have an equation. They subtract a certain amount of carbon from the rock that they find, and they say, this is the carbon that's actually in the rock, because they assume that a certain amount is just going to be the base level of contamination, because it shouldn't be there, but in reality it is there. So this creates an interesting problem, which is that actually shapes the reports of the raw data. If you're looking at reports of how much carbon is in a particular rock, they're going to report the actual number minus the stuff which they shouldn't find. And if you're not familiar with how that research is done, you're not even going to notice that the problem is there. This is actually a very interesting problem you find in general, which is that sometimes data is just misreported. Someone just makes a mistake, and then someone cites that mistake, and someone cites the citation of that mistake. And very soon it looks like you have 1,000 sources, which are all giving you the same number. But you trace them back to their origin, you find it's just one guy who accidentally made a wrong measurement. In something which is called the Coconino Sandstone, this is a very large sandstone formation. And depending on whether sandstone is formed in desert or underwater, it's going to generate sand dunes, which are a certain amount of space apart. Now, the measurements for the Coconino Sandstone were made in the 1950s, and they were more coherent with the idea that it's a desert sandstone. And that was a very significant problem for young age creationists until a few people went back and they just redid the measurements, and they realized, oh, the first guy, maybe he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Maybe he just, his ruler was off. For whatever reason, he misreported the data. And for about 70 years, nobody realized that it had been misreported, because that's a boring thing to do. Nobody wants to spend their time going out and measuring sand dunes. But that can have very significant effects downstream. So dinosaurs, I want to get to the dinosaur question. I'm sorry, someone say something?
No, we were just like, yeah, dinosaurs.
Okay, yeah. So when God created the world, he created the world, obviously, how do I put this? He arranged the world in such a way that there were very different biomes. Today, we find that different kinds of animals are kind of mixed up together, but because God created things in place, he placed animals in a particular area, you find that there are very different regions where there's very different kinds of life. For example, in the pre-flood world, I don't have time to make the argument for this, but one of the pieces of evidence is that many of the trees that you find in the fossil record are hollowed out. They're hollow trees. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the idea of a quaking bog. A quaking bog is basically, it is an area of land which is floating. And it floats because it is the remnant of a glacier which gradually melted. And the kinds of plants which can exist on this floating piece of land are going to be hollow. There aren't any hollow trees today, but if God created the world in place, he could simply create a floating forest from scratch. And actually, the kinds of plants that you find there indicate that that's kind of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a very, very large continent-sized floating forest, which sounds kind of kooky, but it actually makes sense of a lot of the data. You find, for example, that smaller plants are the ones that are buried first, because on the outside of a quaking bog, it is the thinnest, and that means that it's not going to be able to hold up much weight. And then as you go up in the fossil record, you find that the plants get heavier and heavier and heavier. But the kinds of plants which are there are the kinds of plants which grow on these tiny floating pieces of land today, except it was much larger before the flood. So when we look at the sedimentary record, the flood waters advanced onto the land, and it buried things as it encountered them. So I think that dinosaurs were created in a particular region of the world, a region of the world which presumably would have eventually been colonized by man, but probably was not to any significant degree at this point in time. And after the flood, that region of the world obviously is not going to reform, because animals come to their present positions by just spreading out from Mount Ararat. And people ask how did they get to Australia and stuff. There's actually a really interesting answer to that question. But one thing I would say in relation to that is actually the secular or the standard model of Earth history has the exact same problem, because the continent separated at a certain point in time. but you find the same animals are on opposite continents, and there's no explanation for how that's the case. The floating forest idea actually provides some explanation for how this happened, because you have little pieces of it that are still floating around, and they're substantial enough to hold large trees. And so it explains actually how animals end up getting transported to various different continents. Whereas even though the secular model or the standard model of Earth history needs something like that, it doesn't have anything in it to explain how that actually happened. So dinosaurs, I think, are in a different region of the world. After the flood, that region of the world, there's no place for it. And so dinosaurs exist in relatively small pockets, but one of the most pervasive features in various human traditions, it's on every single inhabited continent, is legends of dragons. So it is not just a weird creationist thing to say that dragons sound a lot like dinosaurs. In fact, among secular anthropologists, one of the most popular theories for the origin of dragon legends is that ancient people ended up digging up fossils and they developed their legends of dragons because they found dinosaur fossils. Dragon legends, I think, and the absolute pervasiveness of these legends indicates that there's some direct human experience with them, but they're quite rare. I personally think, I know this sounds really kooky, and at some point in the past, I would have, slapped someone in the face for saying something this silly. But I personally think that there are some small pockets of dinosaur populations that are still alive. One of the reasons that I would say that is because reports of living dinosaurs tend to come from very specific places in the world. Now, if people were just watching National Geographic and then they saw a bird and they thought it was a dinosaur, you would not expect them all to be from Oregon or something. Why are all these people from Oregon obsessed with dinosaurs? But you find in particular regions of the world, people keep reporting this. Now, what's really interesting is the kind of pterosaurs that they report. So pterodactyls, the flying kind of dinosaur. Pterodactyls are they're on National Geographic, they're in science magazines, but it's a specific species of pterodactyl, which tends to be the stereotypical one, the one that gets shown in all the pictures. That is not what people report. People actually report a different species, which is not usually depicted. It doesn't have a tail. That's what sets it apart. And people will mention, oh, it didn't have a tail. I didn't have a tail. We know that exists from the fossil record, but it's not the image that people are going to get from watching the Science Channel or something like that. And so that fact seems to indicate to me that I think there's real experience with actual dinosaurs in very small pockets. Now, the large species of dinosaurs, I think, went extinct in the flood. And this relates to a question that someone asked about how Noah fit all of these animals on the ark. You can breed llamas and camels together. You can breed lions and tigers together. You can breed very different species of animals together. And that indicates that they have a common ancestor. There really is some kind of evolution that's going on there. But given the age of the earth, according to what I think is a biblical framework, that had to happen much more rapidly. Now, some people will say, well, creationists believe in more evolution than we do because they believed it happened so rapidly. But I think that misses the point, because the point is not how much change happened. The point is how it happened, because I don't think this is random. I think God has inbuilt a great deal of potential information into our genome and into our mode of passing on our characteristics that is not activated. So most of you, I think, are probably familiar with blind cave fish, right? So fish that go into a cave with no light, they're blind. Their eyes don't work. They don't need their eyes. It would be a waste of energy to have working eyes. Now, it was generally assumed in the past that that's because the gene for producing working eyes just got broken and it didn't need to get fixed. And so they didn't die out. In fact, what actually happened is when fish reproduce and go into an area with no light, somehow their genome is rewired and it just turns off. The gene turns off. And if they come out of that, if they produce offspring who need eyes, it'll rewire itself again and they will have working eyes again. This is also true for, scientists have created a chicken with teeth, because chickens have genes to produce teeth. Actually, most birds do. It's just turned off. Now, that has usually been explained as the result of their having been descended from dinosaurs in the past. They don't need that gene anymore, but you can cause it to start working again if you manipulate the genome. I think the problem with that is you would expect random mutations to have broken it, to make it unworkable so that you couldn't turn it on anymore. because random mutations happen all the time. If a gene is unnecessary, then it won't make any difference to whether they're going to survive or not. But for some reason, those genes are what scientists call conserved. They continue to be workable even when they aren't, strictly speaking, necessary. One of the most interesting theories within the mainstream scientific community is called natural genetic engineering. And basically what that's about is the fact that if you look at organisms under certain circumstances, they can rewire themselves and change very, very, very rapidly, not randomly, but in response to environmental pressure. So they need to produce a certain feature, and somehow it knows that, and it will rewire itself in that way. So what that tells me, and what that indicates, is that after the flood, you have kind of a core representative sample of what creationists call Brahmins, which is a combination of the Hebrew word for created in kind. So the original kinds of animals then flowered forth and expanded and produced many, many, many new species. So llamas and camels have a common ancestor. Lions and tigers and jaguars and all those things have a common ancestor. And what's interesting is if you look at the fossil record for the tertiary period, which is the post-flood fossil record, you find that almost every single one of those early organisms is very small. The kind of horse that we find in the earliest tertiary fossil record, in the earliest period after the flood, is very small. The earliest canines are very, very, very small. So it looks like on the ark, God brought Noah the smallest versions of every created kind. And then after they left, then their genomes rewired themselves and they changed very rapidly to fit the new environments that they were entering into. So I think the same thing is true with the dinosaurs that were brought on the ark. You didn't have the massive dinosaurs that I think existed before the flood. What you had is relatives of them who were much smaller. And that's also coherent with the kinds of reports that we have of in terms of dragon legends and things like that. And also, if you just look at like 18th and 19th century newspapers, it's not that long ago. 18th and 19th century newspapers will sometimes have little articles on the side. There's a dragon which is pestering the local farmers. And, there's the legend of St. George, where, there is a dragon who lives in a cave and he's eating people's sheep. He's a pest. So someone has to go out and kill this thing. It's very matter of fact. It's very mundane. But it's, it's something people know about. They know that there are these creatures out there. They're really annoying. And so you want to kill them. You want to get rid of them. So I think there's reason to think that they persisted in small pockets after the flood. One of the interesting things about dragons or dinosaurs is that in the Bible, one of the words for dragon is serpent. So actually the word nachash, which is translated serpent, it means you can also render it dragon, or you can render it bright one. The word seraph, so my name Seraphim, that comes from a guy who was named after the Hebrew word for burning. So it means burning one, because seraphim are a kind of angel. They're very bright beings, but it also can be translated serpent. So angels are actually associated with dragons in this interesting way. And you find this in the iconography and the symbolism of various ancient cultures, that large serpents get associated with angels in interesting ways. Also, birds get associated with angels in interesting ways. You find in the book of Revelation that unclean spirits are connected symbolically with unclean birds. So, and there are birds that live in the temple. There are birds that live in the temple in the portion of the temple which symbolizes the dwelling place of the angelic hosts. So the angelic hosts are clothed in bright colors and glory and beauty. God has created birds to be clothed in bright colors and glory and beauty as well. The angels are constantly singing and praising God. Well, every morning we find that the birds are doing the same thing. So an article I read about a year ago, why do birds sing? And scientists have tried all sorts of explanations for why every bird seems to have this song. And while people say, it's about mating, they do have some mating songs. The conclusion of a number of scientists recently has been, birds sing because it makes them happy. So it's an interesting kind of, we tend to assume that there must be some utilitarian function other than, praising God, other than delighting in creation, that God created all creatures to enjoy him. But the interesting thing here is that dinosaurs, have feathers. There are a number of dinosaurs are feathered. So you find feathered dinosaurs in the fossil record. And that actually makes a good deal of sense based on the kind of symbolism, which is true for both birds and dinosaurs. It's not just because. It's when you look at not just how a particular organism uses a biological feature, but what does it mean? What is God trying to say about himself? What is God trying to say about his world in building organisms in this way? Are there some things about animal biology, which are just there to make the world beautiful. So why are there flightless birds, for example? Well, wings are not just something so that you can fly. Wings mean something in scripture and in Christian symbolism. So I think that's important to understand if we want to have a fully Christian view of biology. Okay, so some animals have features that seem to be only valuable for hunting or eating meat, a spider weaving a web, for example. How do young earth creationists view the purpose of these designs if death didn't exist before the fall? And one of the most interesting things that you find when you start looking at the category of a biological family, which I think is roughly, not exactly, but roughly equivalent to a created kind, is that almost every biological family, which we know as carnivorous, so alligators and crocodiles, they eat meat. But in the fossil record, you find that there is a species of alligator which is herbivorous, which only eats plants. Now, in 2001, they finally discovered an herbivorous spider. And so I think what we find in biology is that almost every created kind, even if it's become mostly carnivorous, we see evidence that at one point it was herbivorous and that its biology is compatible with that. So spiders actually use their web for other things besides catching prey. They use it sometimes to protect their young. They use it sometimes to swing from place to place. There are purposes for its existence other than catching prey. But when the world falls into sin, when it's wounded, one of the things that I think happens in relation to animals rewiring their DNA, rewiring their genomes and producing new features, is the kinds of features that start getting produced utilize things that were meant for another purpose, and they become enslaved to death and bloodshed and something like that. There's a type of beetle which is considered a pest because they destroy forests, but actually it's really interesting. If you look at the biology of that beetle, it has a relative which doesn't destroy forests. It's actually really important for maintaining it. It controls the amount of foliage in a forest so that the forest continues to exist. And so you can see how the creation starts to misfire, and certain things which are meant for one purpose, which are meant to uphold it and to make it more beautiful and to sustain it in its existence, start getting rewired and misused and misapplied in relation to death. I know it's 8 p.m. Can I answer one or two more?
Yeah, I think we're fine. Go ahead.
Okay. And you can just cut me off if, gotta get out. Why are we not all considered family or siblings since we started with only two people, Adam and Eve? I think scripture uses the language of a human family a lot. So, for example, when David is crowned as king, they say, "You are bone of our bone, flesh of our flesh." The Hebrew word for bone actually means self. And when Solomon speaks to his bride in the Song of Songs, he calls her my sister, my bride, because the language of brotherhood and sisterhood is language that is used to express a common the common origin and the common family heritage we all have from Adam. So Paul speaks of the way that people should treat their future spouses. He says, regard each other as sisters in the Lord until you're married, and so forth. So I think scripture actually does use the language of the single human family a great deal. We tend to consider cousins something that's other than brotherhood. Like cousins are a category which is exclusive from the category of brotherhood. Scripture seems to use the word brother in a broader way. So we're all brothers and sisters, not in a metaphorical sense, but just in terms of the concept that is contained in that Hebrew word. So I think we are considered a family or siblings, both in the Lord and in the flesh in Scripture. And I want to just hit, what are we supposed to make of proven primitive humanoid species? And this will be the last one that I hit, unless you demand that I hit something else, or else you'll hang me. So what are we supposed to make of those? Well, remember I mentioned how animals can rewire their genome, and they can change very, very rapidly because God built information into animals that they don't use at the point of creation, but as that species or as that created kind develops, it becomes more and more diverse, and it produces all kind of beautiful variety. That's true for human beings as well. So, and the human form is a lot more malleable, I think, than we than we tend to assume. However, since human beings were all in one place for much longer than animals were. Animals started spreading across the world right after the flood. Well, human beings stayed at Babel, stayed in one place for a very long period of time. That means they intermarried all across the human race, meaning they didn't become more and more distinct from each other by and large. I think you probably had small populations which left, but the vast majority of the human population stayed in one place. And I think that's why there's really only one species of human which is extant today, remembering that a species is a scientific classification. It's not something that is a absolute barrier in God's creation design. But we have almost all Europeans have Neanderthal DNA in them. So we have Neanderthal DNA if you're descended from Europeans. Neanderthals, they have, they're much stockier. They're much more built than Homo sapiens, but they're descendants of Adam. They made musical instruments, we find. They made very sophisticated technology and art. Another interesting species is the so-called hobbit species. So on the island of Flores, there is a hominid species called Homo floresiensis. And it's about a 3-foot tall hominid. It looks like us, except it's very, very small. It has a very small head. However, brain size is not as important as people think. In fact, if the brain dies gradually, you can have a person for whom 95% of their brain is just dead, but you couldn't tell the difference. They seem completely normal because the brain can rewire itself very efficiently. And so people have assumed that a small or large brain has a lot to do with intelligence, but I think it doesn't have nearly as much to do as people imagine. So you can have a very small person who's just as smart as anybody else would be. And the interesting thing is that on this island, there are actually traditions of a very small race of people, but they talk and they have clothes. And that's how you know that a person is a descendant of Adam. They talk, they have clothes. Language distinguishes human beings from everything else, and we all wear clothes. And so I think that indicates that they're descendants of Adam. The highest amount of variety among hominid species, that is species that basically are within our larger biological family, is right near the mountains of Ararat. It's at Dmanisi, in the country of Georgia. That's a stone's throw away from where the Ark landed. And you find a very large number of fossils there, which if they had been found in different continents, it would have been assumed that these are very different species that were millions of years apart. But what it looks like is that very close to the mountains of Ararat, you have a period of time where biological change is happening much, much more rapidly. And thus you can have a single population where every member of that population looks radically different from each other because there are certain triggers which cause organisms to change much more rapidly. And as I say, this has been, there is, if I could remember the name of the lake, it would be really nice. But there is a documented example of where this process was happening. They kept looking for new species of fish in the lake, and they realized, why are we still discovering them? And they realized that actually more than one new species of that fish was being produced per day. Something had triggered this rapid diversification process. And I think those triggers were operative after the flood. But basically, by the time of the dispersion from Babel, things had slowed down. And because most of the human population had been in one place, there wasn't that kind of variety that we see in other animal organisms. And then when people dispersed from Babel, whatever little populations of human beings had wandered away were kind of integrated into the main human population, which is why Europeans have about 4% Neanderthal DNA in them. So there's a lot of interesting research going on there. If you look at that documentary, Is Genesis History? Todd Wood has discussed this. There's a great deal of new research, of really fascinating stuff that's coming out in everything that I've talked about today. So that's where I'll leave off.